She pressed her palm flat against the study door, and the wood was warm beneath her fingers. Warm and solid, and nothing like the words bleeding through it. I never wanted her. 4 words. That was all it took to end 8 years of silence she had mistaken for love. Eleanor Whitman did not cry. She did not knock. She reached up, slid the ring from her finger, and set it on the door handle without a sound. Then she turned and she walked. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this journey travels. The summer of 1812 sat heavy over the Ashford estate like a wool blanket no one had asked for. The kind of heat that pressed into the back of your neck and reminded you that comfort was something other people were allowed to have. Eleanor Whitman. She had kept her maiden name quietly in the private chambers of her own mind for most of the 8 years she had worn Julian Ashford's ring, arrived at the front drive just past 4 in the afternoon, her traveling trunk strapped to the back of a hired coach, her back straight, her jaw set, and every nerve in her body humming with the particular frequency of a woman who has already made a decision she hasn't admitted to herself yet. She had come back 2 days early. That was the first thing. The second thing was that no one was waiting at the door. She paid the driver herself, tipped him fare, and watched the coach rattle back down the oak-lined drive before she picked up her smaller bag and pushed through the front entrance. The house was quiet in that specific way, that houses are quiet when the people inside them believe they are alone. She could hear voices, low, male, indistinct, somewhere toward the back of the east wing. She set her bag down in the entrance hall and stood still for a moment. She had not been back to the Ashford estate in 4 months. She had been visiting her aunt in Philadelphia on what Julian had described with characteristic economy of feeling as an appropriate change of air. He had said it the way he said most things, with precision, without warmth, as though each word had been measured for cost before spending. 4 months of letters that answered her questions without ever quite asking any of his own. 4 months of performing the role of a woman grateful for her husband's patience. She had turned 34 in Philadelphia. Her aunt had baked a small cake, and they had eaten it together in the afternoon garden, and Eleanor had laughed at something she could no longer remember what, and realized with a start that she hadn't laughed in longer than she could count. That had been the beginning. She moved down the corridor toward the east wing without announcing herself, which was not unusual. She had always moved quietly in this house. Julian had commented on it once early in the marriage, and she had taken it for a compliment at the time. You carry yourself without noise, Eleanor. She understood now that it had not been a compliment so much as a statement of preference. The study door was slightly ajar. Not open, not closed. The kind of ajar that happens when a man assumes he has the house to himself and does not bother to latch what he does not expect to need latched. She was 4 steps away when she heard the voice, not Julian's. A man she recognized as Aldous Crane. Julian's attorney, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him at their wedding, and looked at Eleanor with that particular expression of tolerant neutrality that she had never been able to fully decode. She'll be back in 2 days, Julian. You have until then to settle this one way or another. And Julian's voice quieter, but close to the door. Close enough that she could hear the fatigue in it, the irritation, the undercurrent of something that was not grief but lived in the same neighborhood. I know that. You've known it for 8 years and done nothing with the knowing. Aldous. I'm not scolding you. I'm telling you what I see. A pause. The sound of a chair. She's a capable woman. She's been capable since the day you married her. The question was never whether she could manage. The question was whether you ever intended to let her. Another pause. Longer. I never wanted her, Julian said. I want you to understand that, not the way a man is supposed to want his wife. I went through the arrangement because my father arranged it, and I was 26 and didn't know how to refuse without destroying everything he'd built. I honored the contract. I have been honorable about every part of this. Honorable? Aldous repeated, and there was something in his voice that was not quite agreement. Yes, honorable. And what does she get from your honor, Julian? What does Eleanor Whitman Ashford get from a husband who has been honorable at her for 8 years? Eleanor's hand was on the wall. She did not remember putting it there. She gets the estate. She gets the name. She gets security and standing in a county that would have given her nothing if she'd stayed a Whitman with a modest property and no connections. She gets everything except a husband who wanted her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. She did not move. She was not sure she was breathing. She was aware distantly of the weight of the ring on her left hand, the gold band Julian had slid onto her finger in the church, while the minister spoke about covenant and fidelity, and the sacred bond between a man and his chosen wife. His chosen wife. She had spent 8 years believing that the choosing had been mutual. "I have been good to her," Julian said, and his voice had changed quieter, flatter the way voices get when a man is convincing himself. "I have never been unkind." "No," Aldous said. "You've been worse than unkind. You've been indifferent. And Eleanor Whitman is not a woman built for indifference." Another silence. "She'll be back in 2 days," Aldous said again, and his voice now carried the particular gentleness of a man delivering a sentence. "Figure out what kind of man you want to be when she walks through that door." Eleanor heard the scrape of the chair. Footsteps. She moved. She did not run. Eleanor Whitman had never run from anything in her life, and she was not about to start at 34 in a corridor she had walked 1,000 times. She turned. She walked back toward the entrance hall at the exact measured pace of a woman who has not heard anything, who has only just arrived, who is simply making her way to put down her bag and call for help with the trunk. She reached the entrance hall. She stood in the center of it. She looked down at her left hand. The ring was a simple band gold without ornament. Julian had asked her once if she wanted something more elaborate, and she had said no, that she preferred simplicity, and he had nodded, as though that confirmed something he already suspected. She had thought at the time that they were reaching an understanding. She understood now that he had simply been relieved. She was not crying. She noticed this about herself with a kind of distant clarity, the way you notice weather through a window. She was not crying, and she was not shaking, and the only thing she felt standing in that entrance hall with the afternoon sun coming through the transom windows and making gold bars across the floor was a sharp, clean, absolute certainty. She reached up. She slid the ring off her finger. She closed her fist around it for a moment, feeling the weight of it lighter than she had expected. All these years, and it weighed so little. She walked back to the study door. She set the ring on the door handle. She did not knock. She did not speak. She picked up her bag from where she had left it, walked back out the front entrance, and stood on the steps of the Ashford estate in the full summer heat of 1812, with no coach and no plan, and nothing in her hands. She stood there long enough to breathe twice, slow and deliberate. Then she started walking. She had forgotten in the years she had lived at the Ashford estate how well she knew the roads between it and Hollow Hill. Hollow Hill had been her mother's house, the Whitman family property, small by Ashford standards, but solid fieldstone foundation, wide front porch, 300 acres of Massachusetts farmland that had been in her family since her grandfather's time. When her mother died 5 years ago, Eleanor had signed papers that transferred management of the property to a local steward her husband had arranged. She had not been back since the funeral. It was 4 miles. She walked it in the heat of early afternoon, carrying her bag, letting the dust of the road settle on her shoes, and she did not allow herself to think about Julian, or the ring, or the weight of Aldous Crane's voice saying she's a capable woman, as though that were something Julian needed to be reminded of. She thought instead about her mother. Catherine Whitman had been a woman of particular stillness. Not the stillness of passivity, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and seeing no reason to announce it to anyone. She had raised Eleanor alone after Eleanor's father died when Eleanor was 9, and she had done it without complaint or ceremony, managing the farm accounts herself, making decisions that the county's male landowners found presumptuous and then proved correct. Eleanor had grown up watching her mother be underestimated by men who had more money and fewer ideas, and she had filed that observation away somewhere deep behind her ribs, where it had sat for years like a coal that nobody had bothered to light. She was beginning to feel it warm now. Hollow Hill came into view around the last bend in the road, the front porch half covered in summer vines, the shutters faded but intact, the fieldstone walls exactly as she remembered them. The steward, a man named Garrett, had kept the outbuildings in reasonable order, and the kitchen garden she could see from the road had been tended with more care than she expected. She pushed open the front gate. She walked up the porch steps. She tried the door and found it unlocked. Garrett had mentioned in one of his quarterly letters that he left it so when he was working the near fields. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was warm with summer heat and smelled of old wood and dried herbs, and something she could not name except that it was familiar in the way that certain things are familiar, not because you remember them clearly, but because they live in your body before your mind can get to them. She stood in the front room and breathed. "Mrs. Ashford." She turned. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen was a woman she did not recognize. Middle-aged, broad through the shoulders, with the look of someone who had been expecting this moment, even if she hadn't known exactly when it would arrive. She was wiping her hands on a work apron, and her expression was not unfriendly, simply measured. "I'm Agnes Clark," the woman said. "I've been keeping the house. Mr. Garrett asked me to come in twice a week to air it out and see to the kitchen. He said the property's owner might be returning." She paused. "I didn't expect you today." "I didn't expect myself today," Eleanor said. Agnes looked at her, really looked the way women look at each other when they are reading past the surface, and then she simply nodded and stepped back. "I'll put water on for tea." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She set her bag down on the front room settee and sat beside it, and for a long moment she simply sat there in the heat and the quiet of her mother's house, listening to the sounds of Agnes moving in the kitchen, the clink of the kettle, the soft percussion of ordinary life, and she let herself feel just for a moment the enormous weight of what she had walked away from and the terrifying, exhilarating, unnameable quality of what she had walked toward. She was not sure yet what it was. She was sure that it was hers. Agnes came in with the tea and set it on the low table and sat across from Eleanor in the plain wooden chair that had been her mother's reading chair, and she did not ask any questions. Eleanor had expected questions. She had been braced for them. The absence of them took her off guard in a way that questions never could. "You know who I am?" Eleanor said finally. It wasn't a question. "I know who you were," Agnes said. "Eleanor Whitman. Your mother was a good woman. I used to bring eggs from our place when she was ill the last winter. She talked about you." Eleanor looked at her tea. "She said you were the strongest person she'd ever known," Agnes said. "Said you just hadn't had the occasion to find that out yet." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "She was right about most things," she said. "From what I've seen, she was right about everything." Agnes sipped her own tea, and her tone was entirely without sentiment, simply factual, the way a woman states the weather. "Will you be staying?" "Yes." "For how long?" Eleanor looked up at her. "I don't know yet, but long enough to matter." Agnes nodded as though this were a perfectly reasonable answer. "The east bedroom is aired out. I brought sheets last week. The kitchen larder has enough for 3 or 4 days if you're not feeding a crowd." She paused. "Are you expecting anyone?" "No," Eleanor said. And then, because honesty seemed suddenly important, more important than it had been in longer than she could recall, she added, "My husband may come, when he discovers I'm here. I cannot say whether that will be soon or not at all." Agnes held her tea steady. "And when he comes? That's the question, isn't it?" Eleanor looked at her hands, her left hand bare now, the skin slightly paler where the ring had been a small ghost of the woman she had been 2 hours ago. "I haven't decided yet." "Then you've got time to decide," Agnes said simply. "That's what the house is for." She did not sleep well that first night, which did not surprise her. She lay in her mother's east bedroom, with the summer dark pressing in at the windows and the distant sound of the creek at the edge of the property carrying through the heat, and she replayed the words in the study corridor with the merciless precision of a woman who had always trusted her memory more than her feelings. "I never wanted her." She turned the sentence over. She examined it the way you examine something you've pulled out of deep water, checking for damage, checking for what's been lost. She tried to feel devastated. She understood that devastation was the appropriate response, the expected one. 8 years of marriage and a husband who stood in his own study and told his oldest friend that she had never been wanted. But what she felt was not devastation. What she felt was the particular cold crystalline relief of a woman who has been suspicious of something for so long that the confirmation of it is not a wound, but an answer. She had known. Not the words, not the specifics. But she had known in the way that a woman who pays attention always knows, in the slight delay before Julian touched her hand, in the way his eyes moved through her, rather than to her at the dinner table, in the 8 years of conversations that had been cordial and informative, and completely devoid of the kind of reckless, unguarded moment that happens between two people who have truly let each other in. She had told herself stories. She was good at that. He is reserved by nature. He shows love through provision rather than expression. He is a man of his generation, of his class, of his training. She had built an entire architecture of explanations around the space where feeling should have been, and she had lived inside that architecture as if it were a home. It was not a home. It had never been. She sat up in the dark and pressed her palms flat against the quilt and breathed until the tightness in her chest eased. Then she lay back down and stared at the ceiling and thought about what her mother had said. The strongest person I've ever known. Just hasn't had the occasion to find it out yet. I'm finding out now, Mama, she said to the dark. I'm finding out right now. Julian arrived on the third day. She heard the horse on the drive before she saw him. She had been sitting on the front porch with the morning edition of the County Gazette and a cup of coffee that Agnes had brewed strong enough to stand a spoon in, and the sound of a single horse at a deliberate walk was entirely different from the sound of hired conveyance or casual traffic. She did not stand up. She set the Gazette on her knee and watched him come up the path, and she noted with that cool clinical part of her that had always catalogued things that he looked tired. Julian Ashford was 41 years old, and had always carried himself with the particular composure of a man who believed composure to be a form of virtue. He was not composing himself now. His coat was travel-dusty, his jaw unshaven by a day, and his eyes, when they found her on the porch, had in them something she had not seen before. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. "Eleanor," he said. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He did not come up. She noticed this. "Julian," she said. The silence between them was a third presence on the porch. It settled into the summer air with a kind of proprietary ease, the way silences do when they have been a long time coming. "You left," he said finally. "I did. Your ring. I know where I left it." He absorbed this. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat, an old gesture, almost unconscious, the kind a man makes when he is trying to locate his manners. "May I come up?" She looked at him for a long moment. "You may stand at the bottom of the steps," she said. "We can speak from here." Something moved across his face that she could not fully read. He nodded once and stayed where he was. "I came to explain," he said. "I know what you came to do," Eleanor said. "The question is whether you know what I need to hear." He was quiet. "Because if you came to explain the words, Julian, if you came to contextualize them, to tell me what you meant and what you didn't, to offer me the version of events that casts you in the most reasonable light, then you made this ride for nothing, and I'll thank you to take your horse back down the drive." He looked at her. The tiredness in his face was more visible now up close. Not the tiredness of a single sleepless night, but something older than that, something worn into him over time, the way roads wear into stone. "I won't try to explain the words," he said. "I said them. They were true when I said them." She held very still. "But they aren't the whole truth," he continued. "And I came because—" He stopped, looked at his hat brim, looked back at her. "I came because the whole truth is something I have never once said aloud to another living person, including you, and I think I believe that you are owed it." The morning was warm and loud with birdsong and the distant sound of Garrett's plow in the far field, and Eleanor Whitman sat in her mother's chair on her mother's porch and looked at the man who had been her husband for 8 years, and she said very quietly, "Then say it." He said nothing for a moment, and then, "I was afraid of you." She blinked. "From the beginning," Julian said. "You walked into that first meeting in your father's parlor, and you were so certain of everything, of yourself, of what you wanted, of what you thought and believed. And I was 26 and I had never—" He stopped again. "I had never met a woman who looked at me like I was something to be assessed rather than deferred to. My mother deferred to my father. Every woman I had known deferred to the men in the room. And you sat down across from me, and you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your time." Eleanor said nothing. "I was terrified," he said. "And then I was angry about being terrified because it seemed unnatural. Wrong. A man, my position, my resources, afraid of a woman's assessment." He exhaled. "So I decided I didn't want you. I told myself I was going through with the arrangement because it was practical, because my father had arranged it, because it was logical. And I kept telling myself that, for 8 years. And now," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Now I don't know what the truth is," he said, "except that when I saw that ring on the door handle, I sat down on the floor of my study like a man who has been shot and didn't know it until the bleeding started." The morning birds went on singing. Garrett's plow turned at the far end of the field. Eleanor Whitman set her gazette on the porch railing, stood up, and walked to the top of the steps. She did not come down. She stood at the top and looked at him, at his tired face and his dust-covered coat and the naked, unfamiliar thing in his eyes that she was beginning cautiously to name. "You may come up," she said. "Agnes will bring coffee. We are going to sit on this porch and you are going to keep talking. And I am going to listen." She paused. "But understand me clearly, Julian. I am not the woman who lived in your house and made no sound and asked no questions. I do not know yet what I am exactly, but I know I am not that. And whatever happens between us from this day forward happens on my terms, or it does not happen at all." He climbed the steps. He stood at the top of them, close enough now that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. And he looked at her with that unfamiliar, unwanted, undeniable thing in his face, and he said, "Yes, ma'am." It was, Eleanor thought, the first honest thing he had ever said to her. She turned toward the door to call for Agnes. Behind her, she heard him let out a breath, long, slow, the kind of breath a man releases when he has been holding it for longer than he knew. She did not let him see her almost smile. Agnes brought the coffee without being asked, set it between them on the porch table, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that the most useful thing you can do in a charged room is keep your hands busy and your mouth shut. She went back inside without a word. Eleanor sat across from Julian, and neither of them reached for a cup. "You said 8 years, Eleanor said. "Yes." 8 years of telling yourself you didn't want me. "Yes. And in those 8 years—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "Was there a single moment, Julian, one, where you considered simply telling me the truth?" He looked at her across the table, and she watched him decide visibly not to deflect. She had seen that decision on his face before the small internal negotiation between the easier answer and the honest one, but she had never seen him choose the honest one, not once in 8 years. "There was a night," he said, "February, the 2nd year of our marriage. You'd been ill for a week, fever. Dr. Marsh had been in twice, and both times he'd left looking more worried than when he arrived." He stopped, turned his coffee cup in its saucer without drinking from it. "I sat in the chair by your bed for 3 nights. You didn't know I was there. You were sleeping or as close to it as the fever allowed. And on the 3rd night you said something." Eleanor frowned. "What did I say?" "You said—" He stopped again. This time the pause was different. It had texture to it, weight. "You said I don't know how to love a man who isn't there. You were half asleep. I don't think you meant to say it aloud, but you did." The morning heat pressed down. Somewhere inside the house, Agnes was moving pots. The sounds of the ordinary world continued indifferently. "And you said nothing," Eleanor said. "I sat in that chair until morning," Julian said. "And when you woke up and the fever had broken, I told you that you looked better, and I went down to breakfast and I never mentioned it again." Eleanor stared at him. "Why?" she said. "It wasn't entirely a question." "Because I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "Because you had said something true, and the truth of it scared me worse than any lie I'd told myself, and so I buried it. The way I buried everything." She picked up her coffee cup, put it down again without drinking. "That is the most honest and most cowardly thing I have ever heard a man say." "I know it. I was ill for a week, Julian. You sat beside my bed for 3 nights and then stood up and went to breakfast." "I know. What kind of man does that?" He met her eyes and did not look away. The kind who spent his whole life being afraid of the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. The silence that followed was different from the silences she had catalogued over 8 years of marriage. Those had been empty. This one was full to the point of pressure. Eleanor felt it against her sternum like a held breath. She stood up. "You should go," she said. "Not forever, but for today. I need to think, and I cannot do that with you sitting across from me looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm something you only just realized you'd been holding." He stood. He reached for his hat. He stopped with it in his hands and looked at her with that unguarded, unfamiliar expression, and he said quietly, "Will you let me come back?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Come back Thursday," she said. "In the afternoon. We'll talk again." He nodded. He went down the steps. He was halfway to his horse when she said his name just once, no more, "Julian." He turned. "The ring," she said. "Don't bring it, don't mention it. Whatever happens between us, that ring was part of a different arrangement, and I will not be wearing someone else's terms for who I am." He held very still. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am." And it was the second honest thing he'd said to her, and it landed the same way the first one had, quiet and sure and entirely without the shape of the man she thought she'd married. She watched him ride back down the drive. She did not let herself feel anything about it until he was out of sight. And then she sat back down on the porch steps and pressed both hands over her face, and stayed that way for a good long minute, breathing. Agnes found her there 20 minutes later and said nothing, which was, Eleanor was beginning to understand Agnes's particular form of eloquence. "He's gone," Eleanor said. "I heard the horse." Agnes sat down on the step beside her. Not close enough to crowd. Close enough to be there. What did he want? To tell me the truth, I think, or the beginning of it. Eleanor dropped her hands, looked out at the drive. "He told me he was afraid of me." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "And what do you make of that?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. "Part of me wants to throw it back at him. What does his fear have to do with me? I lived with the consequences of it. I didn't cause it." She paused. "But another part of me—" She stopped. "Go on," Agnes said. "Another part of me recognizes something in it," Eleanor said carefully. "Because I've been afraid too. Not of him exactly. Of needing something from him and not being able to say so. Of asking for what I wanted and being told by his silence, by his distance, that I had asked for the wrong thing." She exhaled. "We were both afraid, and neither of us spoke, and we wasted 8 years being careful with each other." "That's a common affliction," Agnes said. "It shouldn't be." "No," Agnes agreed. "It shouldn't." They sat in the summer heat for a moment, and then Agnes said without preamble, "There's a desk in the back study. Your mother's. I didn't touch it when I was airing rooms. It was locked and I didn't think it my place. But I found a key in the kitchen drawer and I thought you should know." Eleanor turned to look at her. "A key." "Small one, brass. It was under the flour tin." Eleanor was already standing. Her mother's study was a small room at the back of the house, east-facing with a low ceiling and a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden. Eleanor had always associated the room with the smell of her mother's particular correspondence paper. Something with lavender pressed into it, faint but persistent. The desk was old, dark oak wide with a deep center drawer flanked by two smaller ones on each side. Eleanor tried the center drawer first. Locked. She fit the small brass key from Agnes's hand into the lock and felt the mechanism give. Inside the center drawer, beneath a folded letter from her mother's attorney and a small leather ledger that she set aside immediately, were letters. A bundle of them tied with a piece of ribbon she recognized as the same blue her mother had used to mark her correspondence. Practical, deliberate, not at all romantic. A dozen of them, maybe more. She lifted the bundle. Looked at the handwriting on the first envelope. It was her name, Eleanor. Not Eleanor Ashford. Eleanor Whitman. Her mother's hand. She sat down in the desk chair and held the bundle in both hands and did not open it for a long moment. Outside she could hear Agnes in the kitchen, and beyond that the distant, indifferent, generous sound of the summer. She untied the ribbon. She opened the first letter. My dear girl, if you're reading this, it's because you've come home. And if you've come home, it means something at the Ashford house has finally cracked, and I say finally, because I have been expecting it since the week after your wedding, when I watched that man look at you across the dinner table with all the warmth of someone solving a mathematical problem. Eleanor, I am going to tell you what I should have said before you married him. I was afraid it would make you feel worse, and I calculated wrong, and I am sorry for it. Eleanor stopped reading. She pressed her thumb against the paper. Then she kept going. He isn't a bad man. I want you to be clear on that. He is a frightened one, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways more difficult. A bad man can be left without guilt. A frightened man who has never hurt you directly, who has only failed to love you adequately, that one is harder. Because you will always be asking yourself whether the failing is in him or in you. And I need you to hear this from your mother, who loved you better than anyone on this earth. It is not in you. It has never been in you. You are the finest person I know, and the most capable, and the most deserving of a love that meets you where you stand, rather than asking you to make yourself smaller to fit into the space a man has prepared for you. Come home, Eleanor, whenever you need to. Hollow Hill is yours. All my love, always. Your mother. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk. She sat absolutely still for the length of time it took her to understand that she was crying. Not the dramatic, convulsive grief she had feared for years whenever she thought of her mother, but something quieter and more complex. The release of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just unexpectedly been given permission to set it down. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up the next letter. There were 14 letters in total. Her mother had written them over the course of the last 2 years of her life, and they ranged from 3 lines to 4 pages, and they were in their entirety the conversation Eleanor had never gotten to have. Her mother's observations of Julian sharp and fair and without malice. Her mother's observations of Eleanor searingly accurate in a way that only love can achieve. Her mother's thoughts on marriage, on autonomy, on the particular loneliness of being a capable woman in a world designed to reward women for being manageable. And then near the bottom of the bundle, folded separately from the rest, sealed. And here, Eleanor stopped breathing, sealed with a wax impression she did not recognize. Not her mother's seal. She turned the envelope over. The handwriting on the front was not her mother's. She recognized it immediately. It was Julian's. She held the envelope for a long time before she opened it. Long enough that the afternoon light shifted and Agnes came to the doorway of the study and looked in and saw Eleanor's face and said very quietly, "Shall I come back?" "Stay," Eleanor said. "Please." Agnes came in and sat in the low chair in the corner, and Eleanor opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 3 years ago. July 1809. 2 years into the marriage. The paper was the heavy cream stock Julian used for his formal correspondence, But the handwriting was nothing like his formal letters. It was looser, faster, as though the words had come out before he could organize them. Mrs. Whitman, I am writing to you because I do not know who else to write to, and because I believe you are the only person in either of our lives who sees your daughter clearly and does not find the clarity inconvenient. I have made a serious error. Not in the marriage itself, in the conduct of it. I have allowed Eleanor to believe that the distance between us is natural or inevitable, or simply the shape of things. It is none of those. It is my failing, and I don't know how to correct it without making everything worse. She is extraordinary. I suspect you know this better than anyone. She is the most extraordinary person I have ever been in a room with, and I have spent 2 years being afraid of that fact, and covering the fear with reserve, and I can see what it is doing to her, and I don't know how to stop it. I am asking you if it is not too great an imposition for your counsel. Not as Eleanor's husband. As a man who is badly lost and knows it, with respect and something very close to desperation. Julian Ashford. Eleanor read the letter twice. She looked up. She looked at Agnes, who was watching her with that measured, careful expression. He wrote to my mother, Eleanor said. Agnes said nothing. 3 years ago, he wrote to my mother and told her. Eleanor stopped, looked back at the letter. He told her I was extraordinary. Yes, Agnes said. He never told me. No. Eleanor stood up so fast the chair scraped backward. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room and her hands gripping the sill, and she breathed through her nose. 4 counts in 4 counts, out the way her mother had taught her to do when she was a girl, and her temper was getting ahead of her good sense. He wrote to a dead woman, she said. He wrote to my mother 3 years ago and told her he was desperate and badly lost, and my mother was already ill. By then she died 6 months after this letter is dated, and Julian knew that he knew she was ill, and instead of... She stopped. Instead of saying a single word of this to me, his wife, the woman who was living in his house and sharing his table and trying every single day to... She stopped talking. The room held the silence. Agnes said very carefully, "Are you angry at him?" "I am furious at him," Eleanor said. "I am furious, and I am..." She turned around and her face was a complicated country. "I am grieving, because he knew. He knew he was failing me, and he wrote it down on paper and mailed it to my mother, and then he sat across from me at dinner that same night and said, 'Pass the bread.' Eleanor and I passed the bread, and we talked about the harvest, and that was the whole of it." She pressed both hands to her sternum. "He had the words, he had them. He just couldn't give them to me." "Some men," Agnes said, "are better at saying the true things to people they're not afraid of losing." Eleanor looked at her. "Your mother was safe," Agnes continued. "She wasn't going to judge him. She wasn't the one whose opinion of him lived in his house every morning. You were." She paused. "I'm not defending him. I'm explaining him." "There's a difference," Eleanor said. "A significant one." Eleanor looked down at the letter in her hands. She read it again. "The most extraordinary person I have ever been in a room with." She read it a third time and found it no easier. "He comes back Thursday," she said. "I know. I'm going to show him this letter." Agnes was very still. "Are you certain that's wise?" "No," Eleanor said. "But I'm certain it's necessary, because if we're going to talk the truth, if he came here to tell me the truth, then he needs to know that I have his." She looked up. "He's been keeping a secret in my name for 3 years. He wrote about me to my dead mother. He owes me the story he couldn't say to my face." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "What will you do if he breaks—" "What do you mean?" "Some men," Agnes said quietly. "When the last wall comes down, they don't know what to do with themselves. They've spent so long being held up by their own silence that when the silence goes, they go with it." She held Eleanor's gaze. "What will you do if Julian Ashford sits on your porch Thursday afternoon and falls completely apart?" Eleanor looked at the letter. She looked at Agnes. "I suppose," she said slowly, "I'll do what women do." "And what's that?" "I'll hold steady," she said, "and wait to see what grows back." Thursday came with a different quality of light. Agnes had made something in the kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and butter, and Eleanor had put on a dress she had brought from Hollow Hill's upstairs cedar chest, one of her mother's altered over years, to fit practical and well-made, and entirely without the formal stiffness of her Ashford wardrobe. She had braided her hair herself. She had not put on any ring. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the bundle of letters and the ledger when she heard the horse. She did not go to the window. She stayed where she was. Let him come to the door. His knock was measured, 3 counts. Not tentative, but not demanding. She noted this. "Come in," she called. He came in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, at the table, at the letters, at the particular expression on her face, and she watched him read the room, the way a man reads a room when he is trying to calculate what kind of conversation he is walking into. "Sit down," she said. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. No porch this time, no pleasant distance. The table was small and old, and the light came in directly, and there was nowhere to hide in this room, and she had done that deliberately. She slid the letter across the table. His letter. The one he had written to her mother 3 years ago. She watched his face. He looked down at the envelope. He recognized it immediately. She could see the moment it hit him. The slight forward tilt, the sudden stillness, the way his hands came flat to the table on either side of it, as if he needed to be anchored. "Where did you find this?" he said. His voice was even, but only barely. "My mother kept it," Eleanor said. "In a locked desk drawer. Along with 14 letters she wrote to me that I never knew existed." He looked up at her. "She wrote to me," Eleanor said. "For 2 years. About her life, about the farm, about you, about us. She never sent them. I don't know whether she intended to, but they were there." She paused. "And so was that." He looked back down at the letter. "Julian," she said. He raised his eyes. "You wrote to a dying woman," she said. "You told her I was extraordinary. You told her you were lost. You told her you didn't know how to stop failing me." Her voice was steady, and she intended it to be steady, and she kept it that way by sheer will. "And then you went to dinner, and you passed the bread, and you said nothing to me. For 3 more years. Eleanor, I am not finished." She said it quietly without heat, and he stopped. "I need you to understand what I am saying. Not as an accusation, as a fact. You had the words. You knew the truth about yourself and about what was happening between us, and you wrote it in a letter, and you sent it to my mother because she was safer than I was." She pressed her hand flat on the table. "I was your wife. I was not your enemy. I was never your enemy. And you chose safety over truth over and over for 8 years, and the cost of that was me." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," he said. His voice was rough in a way she had never heard it, raw-edged like something torn. "I know that. I've known it since the morning I found that ring on the door handle, and I sat on the floor and I couldn't—" He stopped, pressed one hand over his eyes, stayed like that for a moment. "I couldn't get up, Eleanor. I sat there for an hour. Marsh came in looking for me, and I told him to leave. I couldn't get up off the floor of my own study." She said nothing. She let him have that. "I'm not telling you that, so you'll feel sorry for me," he said, dropping his hand. His eyes were red at the corners. Julian Ashford, who had never in 8 years shown her a single unguarded thing, was sitting at her mother's kitchen table with red-rimmed eyes and his hands flat on the wood, and nothing between him and the truth. "I'm telling you because I need you to know that what you did leaving it wasn't nothing to me. It was everything. It broke something open that I don't think I had the courage to break myself." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Then I did you a kindness," she said carefully. "You did me the most important thing anyone has ever done for me," he said. "And I know I have no right to ask you for anything now. I know that. But I'm asking anyway." He held her gaze. "Don't close the door. Whatever you decide about the marriage, about us, about what you want your life to be, don't close it before we've had the chance to find out what's on the other side." Eleanor picked up the letter he'd written to her mother. She looked at it one more time. She set it back down in front of him. "You're going to tell me," she said, "everything you wrote in that letter, in your own words, out loud, directly to me, not to a dead woman, not to Aldous, to me." She met his eyes. "And then I'm going to decide what the door does." He looked at the letter. He looked at her. And then Julian Ashford, who had been composed and careful and correctly mannered for 41 years, put both elbows on her mother's kitchen table and began in a voice that was nothing like his usual voice to tell her the truth. She listened. She did not reach for his hand. But she did not look away. He talked for 2 hours. Eleanor had expected maybe 40 minutes, the careful, edited version of a man who had spent a lifetime measuring his words for cost. She had expected him to tell her the broad outline, the shape of things, the dignified confession of a man who understood he owed her something, and was prepared to pay the minimum acceptable amount. She had not expected this. Julian talked the way a man talks, when he has been holding water back with his bare hands for years, and has finally stepped aside. He talked about his father, a man Eleanor had met twice and found magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, and the particular kind of love his father had practiced, which was the kind that required excellence and offered approval only in its place. He talked about the first time he had walked into her father's parlor and seen Eleanor Whitman standing at the bookshelf with a volume in her hands, and her chin lifted slightly, reading without any awareness that he had entered the room completely self-contained, completely sufficient, completely uninterested in performing herself for his benefit. "I thought you were the most alive person I had ever seen," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, and his voice had the particular quality of something spoken into a small space where the speaker expects no echo. "And I shook your father's hand, and I sat down across from you, and the first thing you said to me was, 'What do you think of Burke's Reflections?' And I said something, I don't remember what, and you looked at me like my answer was merely adequate." He paused. "I went home that night, and I read the entire volume." Eleanor stared at him. "You told Aldous you never wanted me." "I told Aldous what I had told myself," he said. "What I had been telling myself since the moment I realized that wanting you and being capable of having you were not the same thing." He looked up at her then. "Eleanor, I have wanted you from the first hour I knew you. What I could not do, what I have failed catastrophically to do, was be someone worthy of being wanted back." She pushed back from the table. She needed space between herself and that sentence. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him. She could hear her own heartbeat, and she did not trust it. "That is not an explanation," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "That is a reason. There is a difference." "I know the difference. A reason is something that explains a choice. An explanation is something that justifies it." She turned around. "Do not ask me to justify 8 years, Julian. Do not ask me to stand in this kitchen and absorb the fact that you wanted me and you were afraid, and you spent 8 years translating that into distance and silence and making me feel—" She stopped, pressed one hand briefly to her mouth, dropped it. "Making me feel like the problem was in my wanting." He stood up. "Eleanor." "Sit down," she said. "I'm not finished." He sat down. "I spent 8 years wondering what was wrong with me," she said. "Not every day. I was not a woman who sat in corners weeping over her inadequacy, but in the small hours, in the moments between things. I wondered what it was about me that made me so easy to provide for and so difficult to love." Her voice did not break. She would not allow it to break. "And now you are sitting at my mother's kitchen table telling me the answer was that I was too much for you, that I was too alive, too certain, too present, and you were afraid." She looked straight at him. "Do you understand how angry that makes me?" "Yes," he said. And then, very quietly, "Do you understand how angry it makes me? At myself." The kitchen air was summer thick between them, and then Agnes appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who has been listening to every word from the next room and has finally heard something that requires her to intervene. "There's a rider," she said, "coming up the drive. Fast. Ig. Aldous Crane rode like a man who had left good sense behind him somewhere on the road and hadn't stopped to collect it. He tied his horse at the gatepost and came up the walk at a pace that told Eleanor before he opened his mouth that whatever he was carrying was not good news. He came through the door without knocking. The door was open. It was summer. Eleanor did not hold this against him and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Julian and Eleanor at the table and the letters between them and whatever expression was on both their faces, and he pulled his hat off and held it in both hands. "Julian," he said, "I have to speak with you." "You can speak in front of Eleanor," Julian said. He said it without looking at Aldous. He was still looking at Eleanor, which she noted. Aldous looked at her. There was something in his face she could not read. "This directly concerns Mrs. Ashford," he said. "So yes, I suppose I can." He came in. Agnes, without being asked, brought a third chair. Aldous sat. He placed his hat on the table. He looked at Eleanor with the particular expression of a man who is about to deliver something unpleasant and has rehearsed the delivery twice on the road and knows it isn't going to be enough. "2 days ago," he said, "I received a communication from Edward Ashford, Julian's brother." Julian went very still. Eleanor looked between them. "Edward." She knew the name. She had met him 3 times in 8 years. A man younger than Julian by 5 years, lighter in disposition, easier in company, and she had always sensed not entirely comfortable with the fact that Julian had inherited the estate and everything attached to it. "Edward is contesting the property settlement," Aldous said. "The one that was established at your marriage, specifically." He stopped, looked at Julian. "He's claiming that the Hollow Hill parcel was incorrectly recorded as part of Eleanor's independent inheritance. He's arguing it falls under the joint estate and therefore under Julian's legal authority." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "Hollow Hill," Eleanor said. She said it the way you say the name of something you have loved your entire life and someone has just told you is on fire. "He filed the challenge 3 weeks ago," Aldous said. "I have been attempting to manage it quietly, but he has retained counsel and the hearing is scheduled for the 3rd week of August." He set a sheaf of documents on the table. "He is arguing in essence that as your husband Julian has authority over any property you hold, including the Whitman family parcel, and that the original settlement was arranged in a way that circumvented that authority unlawfully." Eleanor looked at Julian. Julian's jaw was tight. His eyes were on the documents, and his hands were flat on the table, and she recognized suddenly something she had never seen on his face before, not frustration, not reserve, but fury. The controlled, precise fury of a man who has just discovered that someone has lit a fire in a room he thought was locked. "Edward came to you," Julian said. "Not a question. A statement." "He came to me first," Aldous confirmed. "I told him I would not advise him in this matter. And he went and found someone who would. Hargrove and Sons, out of Boston. They're good. I know how good they are." Julian looked at Eleanor. His voice when he spoke to her was different, no longer the raw, careful confession of the last 2 hours. This was the other version of him, clear, fast, direct. "This is my brother, not the law. My brother has decided that your independence is inconvenient to his interests, and he has found a legal mechanism to challenge it." He paused. "Eleanor, I need you to know that I had no knowledge of this." She held his gaze for 3 seconds. "I believe you," she said. And she did, which surprised her slightly. "Good." He turned to Aldous. "What is our position?" Aldous opened the sheaf of papers. "Your position is defensible, but not guaranteed. The original settlement language is solid. I wrote it myself, and I wrote it carefully, but Edward's argument hinges on an interpretation of the property laws that 2 judges in this county have been sympathetic to in recent years." He paused. "There is also the matter of the marriage itself." Eleanor looked at him. "What about it?" Aldous met her eyes. He looked for the first time she could remember genuinely uncomfortable. "Eleanor, if you and Julian are functionally separated, if you are living here, and he is at the estate, and there is public knowledge of a break, then Edward's argument becomes significantly stronger. Because a wife living apart from her husband in a property she holds independently could be framed as As a woman who has abandoned her marriage and thereby forfeited certain claims, Eleanor said. In simplified terms, yes. She looked at the documents. She looked at her hands, bare both of them, not a ring in sight. She thought about Edward Ashford, whom she had met 3 times, and who had shaken her hand at her wedding with the easy, confident grip of a man who did not consider her a meaningful variable in any equation. She thought about her mother, about the letters, about Hollow Hill is yours, Eleanor. Tell me, she said very quietly to Aldous. If Julian and I publicly, clearly, before any court or community, demonstrate that the marriage is intact, that I am living here with his knowledge and support, that this is an arrangement he has sanctioned, does that change the hearing's probable outcome? Aldous looked at Julian. Julian looked at Eleanor. It changes it significantly, Aldous said. How significantly? It effectively removes the abandonment argument. Edward would be left with only the property interpretation question, and I am far more confident in our position on that ground. He paused. But Eleanor, I have to ask, given the current... He waved a hand carefully at the letters on the table, at the 2 of them, at whatever was visible in the room. Given the current situation between you and Julian, is a public demonstration of marital integrity something you are willing to... I'll do it, Julian said. Eleanor turned to look at him. Not to save the property, Julian said, fast and direct. I want that understood. Hollow Hill is yours. It was yours before you married me, and it is yours now, and if I have to stand in front of every man on the county bench and say so, I will do it. He held her gaze. But I'm not going to pretend the marriage is something it isn't in order to protect a legal position. That is not what I'm offering. Then what are you offering? Eleanor said. I'm offering the truth, he said, which is that I came here Thursday because I wanted to come, not because I had a strategy. Which is that I have been sitting at this table for 2 hours, saying things I have never said to another person, because you deserve to hear them. Which is that whatever you decide about us, that doesn't change what I think Hollow Hill is. It's yours. It was always yours. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Aldous. Set up the hearing, she said. Julian and I will appear together. She paused. And you tell Edward Ashford that if he wants to argue that this woman has no claim to her mother's land, he is welcome to make that argument in front of every person in this county who knew Catherine Whitman. He will not enjoy the experience. Aldous looked at her. Then he looked at Julian. And something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who has just revised a long-held assessment. No, Aldous said quietly to no one in particular. I don't imagine he will. Julian stayed after Aldous left. Eleanor did not ask him to. She also did not ask him to go. She stood at the kitchen counter going through the legal documents Aldous had left behind, and Julian sat at the table and said nothing. And after a while, Agnes brought more coffee, and the 3 of them existed in the same room, in the particular companionable silence of people who have been through something together and are not quite ready to name it. It was Agnes who broke it. Your brother, she said to Julian with the directness of a woman who has been quiet long enough. Does he know what he's doing to her? Julian looked up. He knows what he's doing to a legal settlement, he said. I doubt he's thought much further than that. Men rarely do, Agnes said, and went back to the stove. Eleanor set down the documents. She turned around. Tell me about Edward, she said. Julian's expression was careful. What do you want to know? I want to know whether this is cruelty or ignorance, she said, because the response is different depending on the answer. Julian thought about it. Neither, he said finally. It's fear. The same thing that's driven every bad decision in my family for 40 years. Edward has always believed that I got what should have been shared. The estate, the name, the standing. He isn't wrong that it was uneven. He's wrong about the remedy. He's using me as the remedy. Yes. To punish you. Yes. Eleanor sat back down at the table. She looked at Julian directly. Then we are going to have a very particular problem, she said. Because I refuse to be the mechanism by which 2 brothers work out their grievances. I will not go to that hearing as a wife defending her husband's honor. I will go as a woman defending her mother's land. And there is a significant difference. I know the difference, he said. Good. Then make sure Aldous knows it too. She paused. And Julian, when we appear together, when we stand in that room and make the case that this marriage is what it claims to be, what exactly are we claiming? He held very still. Because I will not lie for the sake of a legal outcome, she said, not even for Hollow Hill. If we stand before that bench and say we are a married couple in good standing, I need that to be something closer to the truth than it has been for 8 years. She held his gaze. Can you give me that? He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her all afternoon. The way she was beginning to understand was not a new thing, but an old thing. She had never been allowed to see clearly before. Eleanor, he said, I am sitting in your mother's kitchen in the house you walked 4 miles to reach when you left me looking at 14 letters your mother wrote you that say more about who you are than anything I ever managed to say in 8 years of marriage. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere. If you'll let me stay, not at the estate, not asking for anything you're not ready to give, but here in this county, working on whatever it is we're working on, I'll stay. She looked at him for a long time. You can stay for dinner, she said. Agnes made something that smells like it's worth staying for. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but lived close to one. Yes, ma'am, he said. It was the 3rd time he'd said it. Eleanor noted that each time it fit better than the last. Check. The trouble arrived before dinner was on the table. Agnes had been moving between the kitchen and the back garden when she came through the door with her hands empty, and her expression changed, not alarmed exactly, but sharpened. Eleanor saw it from across the room and was already standing when Agnes said, There's a woman outside. She asked for Julian. Julian looked up. She didn't give her name, Agnes said. But she rode here herself, no escort, and she's been sitting on your front gate post for 10 minutes like she's deciding whether to knock. Eleanor looked at Julian. Julian's face had gone through 3 rapid expressions she couldn't fully translate, and that itself told her something. Who is it? Eleanor said. Not a question. I don't know who Agnes saw, Julian said, carefully. Julian. He met her eyes. It may be Margaret Thorne, he said. The name landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Eleanor knew the name. Every woman in the county knew the name. Margaret Thorne was the daughter of Senator Thorne, educated, elegant, 29 years old, and the woman who had reportedly turned down 3 proposals in the last 4 years while maintaining a correspondence with half the significant men in Massachusetts. She was also, Eleanor now recalled with a clarity that felt like cold water, the woman she had once heard Julian's mother describe as the girl Julian should have married. She looked at Julian. Why, she said very evenly, would Margaret Thorne ride to Hollow Hill looking for you? I don't know, he said, and then 1 beat too late. I haven't spoken to Margaret in over a year. The 1 beat too late was enough. Agnes, Eleanor said, please ask Miss Thorne to come in. Eleanor, Julian started. I said please ask her in. Eleanor sat back down at the table. She laid both hands flat on its surface. She composed her face into the expression her mother had called her courthouse face, the one that revealed nothing and absorbed everything. Whatever she has come here to say, I would rather hear it in my own kitchen than wonder about it in my own kitchen. Agnes went. Julian looked at Eleanor. I need you to know, not now, Eleanor said. Eleanor. Julian. She said it quietly, but with a firmness that stopped him mid-sentence. In approximately 30 seconds, a woman I have never spoken to is going to walk through that door, and I am going to greet her graciously because my mother raised me right, and I intend to honor that. So, whatever you need to tell me about Margaret Thorne, you will tell me after. Do you understand? He looked at her. The corner of his jaw moved. Yes, he said. The front door opened. Margaret Thorne was exactly what Eleanor had expected, and nothing like her. She was tall, with the self-possession of a woman who had been beautiful long enough to stop using it for anything, and her expression when she came through the kitchen doorway and saw Julian at the table and Eleanor across from him was not guilt or defiance. It was relief. "Julian," she said, "I'm sorry to come like this. I heard about Edward's legal challenge. My father told me this morning." She stopped. She looked at Eleanor. Something in her expression shifted again, not discomfort, but a kind of recognition. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "I'm Margaret Thorne. I don't expect you to welcome me, but I came because I have information that concerns you directly." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Sit down, Miss Thorne," she said. "Agnes will bring another cup." Margaret sat. She looked at Julian once briefly, and in that look Eleanor read the entire history of something, not a present thing, not a living thing, but the ghost of something that had once been possible and had been set aside. She filed this information without comment. "Tell me," Eleanor said to Margaret. Margaret set her hands on the table. "My father was in Boston last week. He had a meeting with Hargrove Edward Ashford's counsel. He was not supposed to overhear what was said, but my father has always had inconveniently good hearing." She paused. "The property challenge is not Edward's primary objective." Eleanor waited. "Edward intends to use the hearing to introduce a separate argument," Margaret said. "He's going to argue not just about Hollow Hill's classification, he's going to argue that the original marriage contract contained a provision regarding issue, children." She looked at Eleanor directly. Specifically, the absence of them. The kitchen was absolutely still. "He's going to argue," Margaret continued, "that the terms of the marriage settlement included an expectation of heirs, and that 8 years without issue constitutes a failure of the marital contract, one that under a particular reading of your agreement would nullify Eleanor's property rights entirely. Not just Hollow Hill. Everything she holds under the Ashford name." Julian stood up so fast his chair went back. "That is not in the contract," he said. His voice was low, and it was dangerous in a way Eleanor had never heard before. "I read every word of that contract. My father read every word. Aldous wrote it. There is no such provision." "Edward isn't arguing it's explicit," Margaret said quietly. "He's arguing it's implied, and Hargrove has found precedent." She looked at Eleanor. "I came because my father believes you deserve to know before the hearing. And because—" She stopped. "Because," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "Because I know what 8 years of being Eleanor Ashford has cost you, and I thought you should have every piece of information available before you decide what to do next." The silence stretched. Eleanor looked at Margaret Thorne. She looked at Julian, still standing white-knuckled. She looked at the letters on the table. Her mother's letters, Julian's letter, the whole archaeology of everything that had been hidden and was now rapidly being forced into the light. She picked up the legal documents Aldous had left. She set them down. She looked at Julian. "Sit down," she said again for the third time that afternoon. He sat. His eyes were on her. "Miss Thorne," Eleanor said, "how much time do we have before the hearing?" 5 weeks, Margaret said. "And your father, is he willing to provide testimony about what he heard?" Margaret's chin came up slightly. "I didn't come here to half help you, Mrs. Ashford." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said. She stood. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to both of them for exactly 10 seconds, long enough to do what she needed to do, which was make a decision she had been building toward without quite knowing it since the moment she set a ring on a door handle and walked into the summer dark. She turned around. "Julian," she said. He looked at her. "We are going to fight this," she said. "Not because of the marriage. Not to save the estate's name or your relationship with your brother or anything else. We are going to fight this because my mother worked this land and her mother before her, and they are not here to defend it, and I am." She moved back to the table and placed both palms flat on it and leaned forward and said with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, "And when we are done, Edward Ashford is going to understand exactly what kind of woman he decided to challenge. Julian looked at her, and in that moment, Eleanor could see it happen the way you see something shift in weather before the air has caught up. Something in his face changed completely. Not the relief she had expected, not the gratitude. Something older and quieter and far more specific. The look of a man who has just fully understood for the first time what he had, and what he had nearly lost. Margaret Thorne stayed for dinner. Eleanor had not planned it that way, but Agnes had made enough for four, and the evening had a momentum to it that seemed to require people to stay in the same room and keep talking. So they did. The four of them, Eleanor, Julian, Margaret, and Agnes, who sat at the table with the self-possessed ease of a woman who understood that the distinction between servant and counsel had become largely theoretical, ate together in the kitchen of Hollow Hill, while the summer dark came down outside, and they made a plan. It was Eleanor who ran the meeting. She did not announce that she was running it. She simply started asking the right questions in the right order, and the others answered, and by the time the plates were cleared, they had the shape of something they could work with. Senator Thorne would provide a sworn affidavit regarding what he had overheard in Boston. Margaret would carry it to Aldous by morning. The affidavit would not be used offensively, not presented as an accusation against Edward, but held in reserve, a weight on the scale if the hearing went sideways. Aldous would lead the legal argument. Julian would appear as a witness to the marriage settlement's original terms. And Eleanor would appear as herself, which was, they all agreed without quite saying so, the strongest card any of them held. Edward will try to rattle you, Julian said. He was looking at her across the table with an expression she was still getting used to, open, attentive, directed at her rather than through her. He'll make the argument about the children. He'll make it in the most public and clinical way he can because he wants you to feel diminished in that room. He can want whatever he likes, Eleanor said. I know that. I'm telling you so you're not surprised. I don't surprise easily. No, Julian said. You don't. And there was something in his voice that was not quite pride and not quite grief, and lived precisely in the space between them. Margaret looked between them with the expression of a woman who has just confirmed a hypothesis she'd had since she walked in the door. She said nothing. Eleanor respected this. One more thing, Aldous said. He had arrived an hour after dinner started, called by a message Julian had sent by Garrett's boy, and was now sitting at the end of the table with his jacket off and his reading spectacles on, and the look of a man who had shifted entirely into the mode of operation that Eleanor suspected was his truest self. Eleanor, when we go into that hearing, you need to be clear in your own mind before anything else about what outcome you are fighting for. She looked at him. Hollow Hill? Specifically Hollow Hill? He held her gaze. Or something larger? She understood what he was asking. She thought about it not long because she had been thinking about it since the moment Margaret had laid Edward's full strategy on the table. But she let herself sit with it one more moment, the way you sit with a match before you strike it. My dower rights, she said, in full, documented, witnessed, and legally unassailable. Not just Hollow Hill. Everything I am entitled to under the law of this state, independent of the marriage, and independent of Julian's goodwill. She looked at Julian as she said it. No offense intended. None taken? Julian said immediately. It's the right answer. Aldous made a note. Then that is what we will argue for. And I want you to understand, Eleanor, that what you are asking for is not what most women in this county have asked for before a bench. The judges will know it. Edward's counsel will know it. You may find the room uncomfortable. I have been uncomfortable for 8 years, Eleanor said. I have become quite good at it. Agnes, who had been quietly washing dishes, made a sound that was almost a laugh. 5 weeks was both too long and not nearly long enough. Eleanor did not go back to the Ashford estate. She had no occasion to, and she had no desire to. Hollow Hill had opened around her in the weeks since her arrival, in a way she had not anticipated. Not just as a house, but as a space that fit the dimensions of who she was, rather than asking her to adjust her dimensions to fit it. She worked the household accounts herself, sat with Garrett twice a week to review the farm records, wrote letters to the county attorney's office requesting copies of her mother's original property documentation, and slept for the first time in years without the particular tension of a woman who is always waiting for someone to decide something that concerns her. Julian came every Tuesday and Thursday. He came in the afternoon, stayed until evening, and left before dark. Agnes let him in without ceremony and without comment, which Eleanor took as an endorsement of the arrangement. Their conversations had changed. They still talked about the hearing strategy documents, Aldous' updates, but they talked about other things too. Books which Eleanor had been reading voraciously since she'd found her mother's shelves. The farm, which Julian knew more about than she'd expected. He'd been managing his own estate long enough to have opinions about soil and drainage, and yield that where she admitted to herself privately intelligent ones. They talked about his father more than once in the careful, complicated way that people talk about the dead, when the dead have left both damage and love in equal measure. One Thursday evening, Julian said, "I want to tell you something that isn't about the hearing." She looked up from the letter she was writing. "All right." "The night you left." He paused. "After I found the ring. After Marsh left me alone in the study. I went upstairs, and I stood in our bedroom, and I looked at—" He stopped. Started again. "I looked at the room, and I realized I could not tell you what color the curtains were." Eleanor waited. "We had lived in that house for 8 years, he said. "I could not tell you what color the curtains were in the room where my wife slept, because I had never truly looked." He held her gaze. "I looked that night. They're blue, a kind of gray blue like early morning. And I stood there looking at them, and I thought she looked at everything. She looked at all of it. She knew every room, every detail, every person on that property. She paid attention because she wanted to be somewhere, and I was too busy protecting myself to notice that the woman I was protecting myself from was the only person in that house who was actually alive." Eleanor set down her pen. "That's the thing I needed you to know," he said. "Not as an apology. You've had enough of my apologies. But as—" he searched for the word. "As evidence. That I have been paying attention. Since you left. That I am not the same man who went down to breakfast." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The curtains are blue-gray because my mother used to say that gray made a room feel like a cave, and blue made it feel like a sky. She wanted the bedroom to feel like sky." She paused. "I chose them on purpose." Julian looked at her. "I know you didn't know that," she said. "I'm telling you now, because you asked, in your way." He said nothing. But something in his face did what it had been doing more and more in recent weeks. It settled. Like a man slowly, carefully learning to be at ease in a room he had been afraid to fully enter. The night before the hearing, Edward Ashford came to Hollow Hill. Eleanor was alone. Agnes had gone to visit her sister. Julian had returned to the estate to prepare documents with Aldous, and Garrett was in the far fields. She heard the horse on the drive, and went to the front door and opened it herself, and there he was, Edward Ashford, 36 years old, lighter than his brother in build, but carrying something in his expression that Julian had never quite had, the watchful, calculating look of a man who has always had to work for what Julian was born to. She stood in the doorway. She did not step aside. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Mr. Ashford," she said. He looked at her the way men look at women they have dismissed and are now slightly too late reassessing. "I'd like to speak with you, privately." "You're speaking to me privately now," she said. "I don't intend to invite you in." He absorbed this. He had the grace not to look surprised. "I want to settle this before the hearing," he said, "without the public spectacle." "I rather think the public spectacle has merit," Eleanor said, "given what you're proposing to argue." "What I'm proposing to argue is an attempt to strip me of my legal rights by exploiting the most intimate aspects of my marriage in a public court," she said. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Let us not dress it in legal language when we are standing on my porch, Edward. What are you settling exactly?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm offering you Hollow Hill," he said. Clear title, no contest, everything your mother left you, in exchange for withdrawing your challenge to the estate division. Eleanor looked at him. You're offering me what is already mine, she said. In exchange for something that has nothing to do with me because your quarrel is with your brother, and you have decided I am the most convenient lever. The estate division was unjust. Then speak to Julian about the estate division, she said. Come to me when I am the one who was unjust to you. Until then, you are a man standing on my mother's porch asking me to hand you a weapon against my husband in exchange for not using a different weapon against me. She held the door steady. The answer is no. His jaw tightened. You may find tomorrow more difficult than you expect. I have found every day more difficult than I expected, she said. I manage. She closed the door. She stood in the front room for 1 full minute, both hands flat at her sides, breathing deliberately. Then she went to the kitchen and put water on for tea and sat down at the table and did not let herself shake until the kettle was boiling. And then she let herself shake for exactly the amount of time it took to pour a cup, and then she stopped. She thought about her mother. The strongest person I've ever known. Just hadn't had the occasion to find that out yet. She picked up her cup. She held it steady. The hearing was held in the county courthouse, a building Eleanor had been in exactly once before, at 17, when her father had a land dispute with a neighboring farmer, and she had sat in the gallery, watching the proceedings with the focused attention of a girl who understood instinctively that this was how the world actually operated. She had not been allowed to speak that day. She had not expected to be. She walked in now on Julian's left, Aldous on her right, with her mother's property documents in a leather case under her arm, and her courthouse face firmly in place. The room was already half full. She noted without expression that most of the county seemed to have found occasion to attend. Edward was already seated at the opposing table. His counsel, a sharp-faced man from Boston named Hargrove, whom Eleanor assessed in approximately 4 seconds as both very good and very accustomed to winning, nodded at Aldous with the collegial acknowledgement of two professionals preparing to try to destroy each other. Senator Thorne was in the gallery. He caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a single formal nod. She returned it. Agnes was there too, in the back row, with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of a woman who has come to watch something she already knows the outcome of. The judge. A man named Hadley, 60 years old, who had the reputation of being fair, and the face of someone who had been tired of human nonsense since approximately 1790, called the room to order. It went quickly at first. Hargrove presented Edward's challenge to the property classification with the clean, organized efficiency of a man who had been in courtrooms his whole life. The language was legal and precise, and it made Eleanor sound like an administrative error, a property misclassification, a contract ambiguity. Nothing personal. Aldous responded with equal precision. Documents were entered. Precedents were cited. Judge Hadley asked questions in a tone that revealed nothing, and then Hargrove introduced the second argument. He did it quietly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than loudness would have been. The absence of issue, he said. The terms of the marriage settlement, he said, viewed in the context of the era's understanding of marital contract, carried an implied expectation. 8 years, no children. A failure of. He paused, and Eleanor felt every person in that room hear the pause's fundamental marital purpose. She kept her face still. She felt Julian's hand under the table close around her wrist. Not tight, not possessive. Just there. Steady. The way you put a hand on someone who is standing on a ledge, not to pull them back, but to let them know they are not alone on it. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Hargrove. Aldous rose. He addressed the implied expectation argument with the methodical, patient precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, and had prepared exactly for it. He cited the actual language of the settlement. He cited 3 comparable cases in which similar implied arguments had been rejected. He was thorough, and he was good, and when he sat down, Eleanor could see in the slight shift of Hadley's expression that the ground had moved. Then Hargrove called his first witness. He called Edward Ashford. Edward took the stand with the composure of a man who had rehearsed this. He was measured, even sympathetic in places. This was not about malice, he said, but about ensuring that the original intentions of the settlement were honored. He looked sincere. He was sincerely full of nonsense, but he looked sincere, and Eleanor watched the gallery and calculated that approximately a third of the room was finding him believable. Aldous cross-examined him with a series of questions so precisely targeted that by the end Edward had inadvertently confirmed that he had never had a direct conversation with Eleanor about the settlement, had never been present at any of the original negotiations, and had received his information about the settlement's implied terms from a lawyer he had hired specifically to find a challenge to it. Aldous thanked him. Edward returned to his seat, looking considerably less composed than when he had left it. Then Aldous called Julian. Julian stood. He crossed to the witness stand. He did not look at Edward. He looked at Judge Hadley, and he spoke with the quiet, specific clarity of a man who has been practicing honesty for 5 weeks and has gotten better at it. He confirmed the original terms of the settlement. He confirmed that the Hollow Hill parcel had been explicitly recorded as Eleanor's independent property at his own insistence, not his father's, not Aldous', his own. He confirmed that the settlement had contained no explicit or implicit provision regarding issue. He said these things calmly and without flourish, and when Hargrove rose to cross-examine him and began to probe the question of marital integrity, the question of Eleanor's independent residence, the question of the ring on the door, Julian looked at him steadily and said, "My wife is living at Hollow Hill with my full knowledge and support. The nature of our domestic arrangement is not a failure of the marriage. It is a decision made by 2 adults who are in the process of building something more honest than what they had before. If that is what you'd like to argue constitutes grounds for legal penalty, Mr. Hargrove, I'd encourage you to reconsider whether that is the argument you want attached to your name." The gallery was very quiet. Hargrove moved on. Hadley made a note. And then Aldous said, "Your Honor, we would like to call Eleanor Whitman Ashford." Dig. She walked to the stand the way she walked everywhere, without hurry, without performance, without any signal that this moment was anything other than what it was: a woman standing in the place where her life was going to be decided, intending to decide it herself. Aldous asked her about the property. She answered clearly, precisely, drawing on documents she had memorized over the past 5 weeks. She confirmed her mother's ownership, her inheritance, the explicit recording of the transfer. Then Aldous said quietly, "Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Hargrove's argument rests partly on the claim that you are in the most fundamental sense not a full participant in the marriage you entered. That you have failed to produce what the marriage was designed to produce. Would you like to respond to that characterization?" She looked at Hadley, not at Hargrove, not at Edward, not at Julian. "Yes," she said. "I would." She took one breath. "I have been a full participant in my marriage for 8 years, she said. "I have managed the household of the Ashford estate with precision and care. I have maintained relationships with every tenant on the property. I have administered correspondence, managed charitable commitments, represented my husband's family at every social obligation the county has offered. I have done all of this while also being a woman, which is to say, while also carrying the specific weight of a person who has no legal standing in the decisions that shape her own life." She paused. "The suggestion that my marriage has failed because I have not produced children is not a legal argument. It is a punishment dressed in legal language. And it is being offered by a man who has never once spoken to me directly, who has no knowledge of the terms or experience of my marriage, and who is using the most intimate facts of my life as a lever in a dispute that has nothing to do with me." She looked at Hadley. "I am asking this court to recognize what the law in this state actually says about a woman's right to property she inherited from her mother. Not what someone wishes it said. What it says." The room was absolutely silent. Hadley looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "how long have you been preparing that speech?" 5 weeks, she said. "It shows," he said, and it was not entirely a criticism. Hadley took 40 minutes. Eleanor sat between Julian and Aldous at the table and did not fidget and did not speak, and watched the clock on the courthouse wall move through those 40 minutes, with the particular stillness of a woman who has done everything that can be done and is now simply waiting for the world to confirm whether it has been enough. Julian said very quietly, not looking at her, "Whatever he says." "I know," she said. "I mean it." "Whatever, Julian," she said. "I know." He was quiet. Then, "Your mother would have been proud." She looked at him. It was the right thing to say, and he had said it right without ceremony, without the slight inflation that would have made it feel like a line rather than a truth. "She would have liked you," Eleanor said, "if you had been yourself around her, which I think you would have been because she was safe and you—" She stopped, looked back at the clock. "You needed safe." He said nothing. But she felt the shift beside her, the minute adjustment of a man absorbing something he is going to carry for a long time. Hadley came back. He ruled in Eleanor's favor on every point. The Hollow Hill parcel was confirmed as her independent property. The implied expectation argument was dismissed as legally unsupported. Her dower rights were affirmed in full, not just Hollow Hill, but every entitlement she held under the law documented, witnessed, entered into the court record. He ruled additionally that the challenge had been brought without sufficient legal foundation, and that the costs of the proceeding would be borne by the challenging party. Edward left without speaking to anyone. Hargrove packed his case with the neutral efficiency of a professional who has lost and intends to be paid regardless. Senator Thorne in the gallery caught Eleanor's eye, and gave her the nod again, the same one, but different now, weighted differently. Agnes in the back row unfolded her hands. Outside the courthouse in the full blaze of the August afternoon, Aldous shook Eleanor's hand, both hands properly, the way you shake the hand of someone you are taking seriously, and said, "Your mother would have been a remarkable attorney." And Eleanor said, "She was." And he nodded and went to speak to the court clerk. Margaret Thorne crossed the courthouse yard and stopped in front of Eleanor and said, "Well done," simply and cleanly, and Eleanor said, "Thank your father." And Margaret said, "I already did." She looked at Julian, who was standing slightly behind Eleanor's left shoulder, not blocking her, not crowding her, but present. "Take care of yourself," she said to Eleanor. Not to Julian, to Eleanor. "I intend to," Eleanor said. Margaret nodded. She walked away in the direction of her horse, and she did not look back, and Eleanor watched her go with a complicated but clean feeling. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular regard one capable woman holds for another. Julian came up beside her. They stood in the yard while the courthouse emptied around them. "It's over," he said. "This part is over," she said. He looked at her. What comes next? She had been thinking about this. Not strategically, she had done enough strategy for one summer, but honestly the way you think about something when you are finally quiet enough to hear yourself. "I'm going back to Hollow Hill tonight," she said. "I'm going to sit on the porch with Agnes and drink tea and let the day finish." She paused. "And on Saturday, I would like you to come for dinner. A proper dinner at a proper hour, not an emergency meeting." She looked at him directly. "And we are going to sit at that table and have a conversation that has nothing to do with Edward or property rights or anything that has happened in the last 5 weeks. We are going to have a conversation that is simply us. What we are. What we might be. What we want." Another pause. "Can you do that?" He held her gaze. "I can do that." "Good." She picked up the leather case. "Saturday, then. Agnes is making something with the last of the summer corn, and I will not have legal documents at the table." He almost smiled. It landed differently on his face than she had expected. Not careful, not composed. Real. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned and walked toward the road, and she did not tell him that somewhere in the back of her mind, behind the courthouse face, and the 5 weeks of preparation, and the absolute necessity of being in that room, The strongest version of herself somewhere behind all of it, she had been carrying the small specific warmth of his hand around her wrist at the table. Steady, present, directed entirely at her. She did not tell him that, but she did not throw it away either. She filed it in the place behind her ribs where the coal had been sitting waiting, and she walked out into the August afternoon with her mother's land secured and her rights on record, and the clear, clean, exhilarating sensation of a woman who has discovered at 34, in the middle of everything falling apart, that she is exactly as strong as her mother always said she was. She had simply needed the occasion. Saturday came in hot and clear, the way the best days of August do, without apology, without qualification, as though the summer had decided to make one final full argument for itself before letting go. Agnes had set the kitchen table with the good cloth, Eleanor's mother's linen white, with a small embroidered border that Catherine Whitman had done herself one winter when her hands needed something to do. Eleanor had not asked her to. Agnes had done it because she understood, as she understood most things, that some evenings required a setting equal to their weight. "He'll be here at 6, Eleanor said. "I know," Agnes said. "You don't have to stay." Agnes turned from the stove and looked at her with the particular expression she had for statements that did not require a response. "I mean it," Eleanor said. We need to talk, just the two of us." "I know what you need," Agnes said. "I'll serve dinner, and then I'll go sit on the porch, and you won't hear a word from me unless something catches fire." She turned back to the stove. "And even then I'll assess the situation first." Eleanor almost laughed. Almost. She went to the front room and stood in the middle of it and breathed. 6 days since the courthouse. 6 days since Hadley had ruled, and Hargrove had packed his case, and Edward Ashford had walked out without speaking. 6 days since she had walked out into the August afternoon and felt the particular, clean, terrifying sensation of a future that belonged to her. She had spent the 6 days working. The farm accounts, the property documentation, 3 letters to the county attorney's office, a long conversation with Garrett about the fall harvest. She had read 2 of her mother's letters again, slowly, differently than the first time, without the emergency of the situation pressing in, and she had found things she had missed in the first reading. Small things. Precise things. Her mother's voice unhurried, saying what she meant. She had not thought about Julian. That was not entirely true. She had thought about him in the way you think about a door. You know you're going to have to walk through, not with dread, not with anticipation, but with the specific quiet attention of a person who wants to be ready. She heard his horse at 10 to 6. She did not go to the window. He knocked, which he had not done the previous times. Eleanor noted this and appreciated it. She opened the door herself. He looked different. Not in any way she could have quantified for a stranger, but she had been looking at this man across tables and down corridors for 8 years. And she could see the difference, the way you see the difference in a river after a storm. The same water, the same channel, but moving differently. "Come in," she said. He came in. He had brought nothing, no flowers, no gift, no gesture that could be interpreted as an attempt to purchase goodwill. She had not expected him to, and the absence of it was right. Agnes served dinner with the quiet efficiency of someone who was also listening to every word and intended to be gone before the real conversation started. The food was good corn and roasted chicken, and the last of the summer squash from the kitchen garden. And they ate together in a way that Eleanor could not recall ever eating with Julian before, without the formal architecture of a dining room, without the correct distance of the Ashford table, without the subtle performance of 2 people who have agreed, without discussing it, to remain strangers to each other. "How is Aldous?" she asked. "Pleased with himself," Julian said, "as he should be. He was excellent. He always is. He just rarely gets the right material to work with." He paused. "You were the right material." She looked at him. "I was prepared." "You were yourself," he said, which is not the same thing but is better. Agnes appeared, collected the plates with the economy of a woman with a schedule to keep, said good night to both of them without making it significant, and was out the back door inside of 60 seconds. They heard the latch. Silence. Eleanor poured tea from the pot Agnes had left. She set Julian's cup in front of him. She sat down with her own, and she looked at him across the table, the same table where he had told her the truth about the letter, where Aldous had laid out Edward's strategy, where she had made the decision to fight, and she said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He looked at her. "Not about us," she said. "Not about the marriage or the hearing or your brother. Something that is just yours, that you've never said aloud." He was quiet for a moment. The summer dark was pressing at the windows. Inside the kitchen, the lamp put warm light on everything. "I used to write," he said. She hadn't expected that. "Write, not letters, not correspondence. He paused, looked at his cup. "When I was younger, before my father decided what I was going to be, I used to write, stories mostly, about people, about situations that interested me. I kept them in a box under my bed until I was 18, and my father found them." "What did he do?" "He burned them," Julian said. "Without asking, without reading them. He said a man who tells stories other people's lives hasn't decided what to do with his own." He picked up the cup, set it down without drinking. "I stopped writing after that." Eleanor looked at him. "Do you miss it?" "Every day of my life." She absorbed this, tucked it carefully into the place where she kept things that mattered. "Tell me a story now then," she said. "Anyone. Make it up." He looked at her like she had suggested something either absurd or wonderful, and he couldn't decide which. "Right now," he said. "You have been very serious for 5 weeks," she said, "and so have I. Tell me a story." He was quiet for a moment, and then slowly, with the particular hesitation of a man uncovering something he had buried carefully. "There was a man who built a house," he said. "And he built it right, solid foundation, good timber, every room in the right place. But he was so afraid of building it wrong that he never once opened the windows. And so the house was perfect and airtight, and no air ever moved through it, and eventually—" He stopped, looked at her. "Eventually the man couldn't breathe inside his own house. And he didn't understand why until the day someone walked out and left the door open behind her." Eleanor held his gaze. "That's not a made-up story," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." The lamp between them burned steady. She asked him then the question she had been carrying since the second week after she'd found the letters, since she'd read her mother's words the second time, and noticed something she had missed the first time through. "Letter 12, she said. He went still. "My mother's letters to me," she said. "Letter 12. She wrote it in October of 1809. Do you know what she said?" He looked at her. His face had changed, a specific change, the particular stillness of a person who has just heard the name of the thing they have been hoping and dreading to hear in equal measure. She said, Eleanor continued, her voice steady, her eyes on him, "that she had received a second letter from you. Not the one I found in the desk, a second one. And that in it you told her you had written Eleanor a letter directly, a real letter, an honest one, and that you had burned it." The kitchen was very quiet. "She said you told her you had burned it because you were a coward," Eleanor said. Her word, not mine. Yours to her. She paused. "So what I need to know, Julian. What I have needed to know for 2 weeks, and have been waiting until I could ask without anger distorting the answer. What did that letter say?" Julian looked at his hands. "Everything," he said. "Be specific." He raised his eyes to hers. "It said that I had been afraid of you from the beginning, and that I had made a catastrophic error in letting that fear dictate 8 months of marriage, and that what I felt for you was nothing like indifference, and that I didn't know how to say any of it to your face without—" He stopped. "Without it being taken from me. Do you understand that I was afraid that if I said it you would take it? You would know it, and you would have power over it, and I would be undone. And so instead," Eleanor said, "you burned a letter and wrote to my mother." "Yes." "And then you went down to dinner and said nothing." "Yes." She put both hands flat on the table. She looked at him for a long moment. and what she felt was not the cold, clean fury of the courthouse, and not the grief she had expected. It was something more complicated and more human than either. It was the feeling of standing in a room that you have decorated entirely in the wrong color, and understanding simultaneously that you cannot unbuild it and that you could repaint it if you were willing to do the work. "You robbed us," she said. "Both of us. You robbed us of the chance to find out whether what you felt was something we could have built on years ago before I spent years wondering what was wrong with me." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I need you to understand that. Not as an accusation you can apologize your way out of, as a fact that lives in this marriage and always will." "I understand it," he said. "And I need you to understand something else," she said. "That I am not sitting at this table because I have forgiven 8 years in 5 weeks. I am sitting here because what you have shown me in these 5 weeks at this table in that courthouse on every Tuesday and Thursday is the person who wrote that letter. The one you burned." She paused. "And I want to know if that person is real. Not the composed, reserved, correctly mannered man who sat across from me for 8 years. The one who burns letters because he is afraid of being known. Is he real, Julian? Is he still there?" Julian looked at her. His eyes were, she had no better word for it, stripped. No composure, no reserve, no careful measurement of cost. Just a man at a table in a summer kitchen, being seen completely for possibly the first time in his adult life. "He is all that is there," he said. "He has always been all that is there. Everything else was architecture." She breathed. "Then we start here," she said. "Not from 8 years ago, not from the courthouse, from here, from this table, this conversation, this version of each other." She held his gaze. "Are you willing to do that?" "Yes," he said, immediately, without calculation. "It will be hard," she said. "I know. You will have to tell me things you are afraid to tell me, and I will have to let you, and we will both have to do this without the protection of the arrangement we had before." She paused. "There is no more arrangement. If we are anything to each other now, we are it, because we have chosen it. Every single time. Not once. Every time." "I understand," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, "There is something else." He waited. "Aldous told me something after the hearing," she said. "Something he said he had been waiting to tell me until the legal matter was resolved." She watched Julian's face. "He told me that in the 3rd year of our marriage, your father came to him privately and suggested that the marriage be dissolved. Using the same argument Edward tried the absence of issue. He wanted to dissolve the settlement, recover the Ashford assets, and arrange a second marriage for you." She paused. "Aldous told me you refused." Julian was very still. "He told me," Eleanor continued, "that you told your father that Eleanor Whitman Ashford's position in this family is not negotiable, and that any attempt to change it would end your relationship with him permanently." She watched him. "You never told me." "No," Julian said. "Why?" He exhaled. "Because I didn't want you to know your position had been threatened," he said. "I didn't want you to feel precarious. I didn't want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that you had only stayed because I had defended you against my own family. I wanted—" He stopped. "I wanted at least that one thing to be solid. Even if I couldn't give you anything else." The silence that came after that was different from any silence they had shared before. It was not empty. It was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have finally, at the end of a very long road, arrived at the same place at the same time. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment, with her back to him, not to hide her face. To give herself one breath of private space in which to be fully what she was, a woman who had walked 4 miles in the summer heat, carrying nothing but her own dignity, who had stood in a courthouse and said exactly what she meant, who had read 14 letters from her dead mother and understood that she had always been loved better than she knew. She turned around. "There is a box in my mother's bedroom," she said. "On the dresser. Would you go and bring it to me?" He looked at her. He did not ask questions. He stood, and he went down the hall, and she heard him moving in the bedroom, and he came back with the small wooden box she had found. The week before, carved oak-fitted lid, the kind of box that holds things you intend to keep. He set it on the table. She opened it. Inside, on a square of folded velvet, was the ring. Not the gold band she had left on the door handle that was still there presumably, or Julian had collected it, she had not asked. This was her mother's ring. A simple thing, silver, not gold, with a small carved knot pattern on the band that her mother had worn every day of Eleanor's childhood, every day of her widowhood, every day of her life, until the day she died, and Agnes had slipped it from her finger and put it somewhere safe. Agnes Eleanor understood now had put it in this box. She picked it up. She held it in her palm. "My mother wore this for 30 years, she said. After my father died, she wore it because it was hers. Not because she was anyone's wife. Because it was the thing she had chosen, and she chose to keep choosing it." She looked up at Julian. "I have been thinking about what you said, about the house with no heir in it." She turned the ring in her fingers. "I don't want a house with no heir in it. I don't want an arrangement. I don't want a marriage that exists on paper and costs us both everything and gives us nothing." She paused. "I want what my mother had. Not the loss, she had plenty of that, but the clarity of it, the knowing, the choosing every morning to be who you are in the space you have made." Julian looked at the ring, looked at her. "Eleanor," he said. And the way he said it was different from every other time he had said her name in 8 years. Different because it was not careful, not composed, not measured for cost. It was simply her name, said by a man who meant it entirely. She slid the ring onto her finger. Not his ring, not the gold band of a contract. Her mother's ring, silver and worn smooth on her own hand, on her own terms. She looked at it. Then she looked at Julian. "I'm not putting on a ring for a marriage," she said. "I'm wearing my mother's ring because it is mine, and she wanted me to have it." She raised her eyes to his. "But I am also telling you, Julian Ashford, that I am willing to find out who we are to each other when we are both trying. Really trying, not the architecture, the people inside it." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He stopped in front of her closer than he had been in months, certainly closer than he had been in years, with this particular quality of intention, and he looked at her with everything on his face, nothing held back, nothing measured. "Can I?" he started. "Yes," she said. He raised one hand and placed it against her face, the side of her face, her cheek. His palm warm and slightly unsteady, the hand of a man who has been careful his whole life, and is choosing right now deliberately, irrevocably to stop. And he kissed her. Not the formal, correct, appropriate kiss of a man honoring a contract, the other kind. The kind that takes a long time to build to, and is over too quickly, and leaves both people standing very still in a summer kitchen with their eyes closed for one extra second, not quite ready to come back. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her. "There it is," she said quietly. "There it is," he agreed. Hotsats. Agnes came back in from the porch an hour later, correctly timed, and found them at the table with the lamp still burning between them, and the remains of the tea, and the box open on the table, and both of them talking. Actually talking the way people talk when they have stopped performing and started simply being in the same space together. She took one look and went to put more water on without saying a word. But Eleanor saw as Agnes turned to the stove the particular set of her shoulders, the exact posture of a woman who is trying not to look as satisfied as she is. "Agnes?" Eleanor said. "My mother told you to put the ring in the box." A pause. "She did. She told you I'd know when to wear it." Another pause. Longer. "She said you'd come home eventually," Agnes said. "She said when you did, you'd figure the rest out yourself. She just wanted to make sure the ring was there when you needed it." She set the kettle on. "Your mother was an extremely practical woman." "She was," Eleanor agreed. She looked down at the ring on her finger. Then she looked across the table at Julian, who was watching her with an expression she was going to spend a long time learning to read, and intended to spend the time on. And she thought about the girl who had stood at a bookshelf in her father's parlor, with her chin up, reading without performing, completely self-contained, not knowing that a frightened young man was walking into the room behind her, and finding her the most alive thing he had ever seen. She thought about the woman who had pressed her palm against a study door and heard 4 words that had cracked open 8 years of silence. She thought about 4 miles of summer road and a house that smelled like her mother, and 14 letters, and a key under the flower tin, and a courtroom, and a judge who had said it shows without entirely meaning it as a criticism. She thought about what it meant to choose something. Not because the arrangement required it, not because the law protected it, not because the alternative was worse, but because you stood in a kitchen on a Saturday in August and looked at a man who had finally opened the window, and you decided that the air was worth breathing. She reached across the table and set her hand palm up on the worn oak between them. Julian looked at it. He looked at her. He placed his hand in hers. Agnes poured the tea. The lamp held steady. Outside, the summer night was full of cricket song and the distant sound of Garrett's Creek and the smell of the last of the season's warmth. And inside Hollow Hill, her mother's house, her house, her house. Eleanor Whitman sat at a kitchen table, wearing her mother's ring and holding her husband's hand, and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember precisely the right size for the life she was living. She had walked away from